Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Monday, December 22nd, 2014 at the Eagleton Institute of Politics here at Rutgers University. For the Center on the American Governor, today I'll be interviewing Sam Crane, who served as treasurer during the tumultuous final 2 years of the administration of Governor Jim Florio. Sam, welcome to Eagleton.
Well, thank you for having me.
Before we get into your experiences in the administration of Governor Florio, which I think we're going to get into in some depth, let's talk a little bit about how you got there. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? What got you to the point where you ended up in the Florio administration?
Well, I was born and raised in southern New Jersey. Spent most of my youth in Williamstown in Gloucester County. I like to tell my North Jersey friends that Cherry Hill was North Jersey, where I grew up. I graduated from Montclair State College at the time, now Montclair State University. And during that time at the university, I was president of the student body, the first student representative on the board of trustees, and got involved in fighting a tuition increase of $25 and $50 a year at that time.
Which was real money in that time.
There was real money in that time. And when I graduated, I went to work for the university, and then I went to become executive director of the New Jersey Student Association and lobbied the legislature for more money and to reduce tuition increases. And that's how I met some friends in the General Assembly, and eventually started at the beginning of the second Byrne term to work for the Assembly Democratic Office.
So this would have been 1977, 78, somewhere in that neighborhood.
79. And then I worked there for a while, took a leave of absence to do some issues in speech writing for then candidate Jim Florio for governor. We came up a little short, 1,767 votes short, if I remember correctly.
How had you, let's go back a little bit, how did you, I mean, was he your congressman at this point?
No, I was living in,
you were up in North Jersey now, or in Trenton.
How it happened was Dan Dalton, then Senator Dan Dalton, was doing debate prep and decided that a colleague of mine, Bob Smart, and I would go down and participate in preparing the governor for the first debate.
Well, at that time, the congressman.
Yeah, a congressman. Once a governor, always a governor. And we sat through this session and realized that the prep books weren't very good. And then the decision was that I would go with the campaign full time to focus on the state part of the issues. And that's what I did. After it was unsuccessful, I went back to the Assembly, spent a few years there, then went to work for then Congressman Florio. Primarily what I did for him was to look at the '85 race to see whether he should go against Governor Kane's reelection. It was career shortening because I'm the one who wrote the memo on why he wouldn't win. Went and worked for the state Senate.
Well, he did listen to you and
yeah, he didn't run, no, which was a good decision. Our polling showed that only among welfare mothers in the Central Ward would we carry the day in November, as I think young Peter Shapiro learned to his detriment. Went back and worked for the state Senate and was working for the state Senate when Governor Florio became Governor Florio. I was in transition briefly. Not sure I had the same view as others in transition about how to handle the fiscal crisis. Went back to the Senate, spent the first year of the Florio administration working for John Lynch as Senate President and the Senate Democrats. After a year, I went into the governor's office as Deputy Chief of Staff and then acting treasurer, and then the last 2 years I was treasurer. I was retired from state service at 12 noon on January 20th, 1994, when then Governor Whitman raised her hand.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go back to your early days as a advocate for student tuition breaks. Did you see this as an entry to politics? Did you see it as an exercise in political science? Were you a partisan Democrat at the time? What was it that caused you to become involved in, what was your major in college?
History,
Okay.
when I went to class. I spent a lot of time doing politics.
All right, so there
but
was
not elective politics, mostly student higher education politics.
All right, but that was clearly in your blood.
Yeah, I loved it.
Okay.
It's the air I breathe.
So the transition from that to the Student Association in Trenton was a sort of a natural jump, but how did that then manifest itself in your getting involved in working for the Assembly?
Well, I was fortunate that I was working for the then State College, now State University, when they were doing the hearings on the income tax. And we were doing one at Montclair State University, and I was working in the Student Center. And a couple of the staff members needed some food and something to drink. One of them was Bob Smart, and the other one was Kathy Crotty.
Okay.
And I met them and stayed in touch with them. And then when the student thing was kind of running dry for me, Bob, then Dick Coffey was the executive director, were starting to build up the partisan staff. And I was invited on board. And my first job, I was in a converted closet running the first district office program for the legislators. That was my high and exalted position. That's where you start is important.
Now, Jim Florio ran against Brendan Byrne in 1977. I
Yeah,
get my
yeah,
decades.
77.
At our age, we get our decades mixed up. And I think finished third and sort of established himself, got his name recognized statewide, but didn't win, but didn't pay any real price for having taken on an incumbent Democratic governor. Were you at all involved in that?
No,
Okay.
no, I was neutral in that race. I wasn't involved in any way.
Did you know Jim Florio at this point? Had you met him?
I had met him, but I didn't know him well. I knew some people who worked for him. But I wasn't heavily involved in what I'll call Democratic politics at that point. I was still am, left of center, Paul, but I was mostly on the cause side of the politics as opposed to the campaign party side at that point.
Okay, for the latter part of the Byrne administration, when you were working for the Assembly, were there specific, aside from the district office stuff that you started out doing, what did you do for the intervening 2 or 3 years before the '81 election came along?
It was a small office, so we did a little bit of
Sorry,
everything.
the '89 election.
And I did, in the Assembly, we still had a joint appropriations committee, and I determined when I was doing lobbying for college students that if you really wanted to have an impact, you had to get a hold of the budget. Because if you had them by the budget, their hearts and minds will follow. And I obviously was not senior enough to get into that. And then somebody who we had working in the office got the chicken pox and was out for the budget cycle. And they shoved me in there because I knew something about it. And that was the beginning of my involvement with the state budget on a committee legislative level. And it evolved over time to where I was the principal staff person for what was then the Joint Appropriations Committee. Larry Weiss, Senator Larry Weiss, a great man, was the chair of it, and I served Larry throughout his career. And the Democrats.
So you had developed some expertise at this point in budgetary and fiscal issues. All right, then along comes the '81 election, which is Florio is the Democratic nominee, Tom Kean is the Republican nominee. You went to work for Florio in the campaign.
Correct.
And what did you do in the campaign?
Mostly issues management, that is filling out questionnaires, providing issues, information for speeches. I wrote some speeches. I wrote the acceptance speech, and I wrote the concession speech, neither of which was ever delivered. And so,
Why is that?
because on
Oh, well,
election night there was no
there was no
concession, there was no
concession, right, of
victory.
course,
It wasn't until Thanksgiving that we had it
I
resolved.
see.
One of my favorite stories about the worst thing that can happen is to be involved in a political campaign and not have an outcome on election day because you're exhausted. I'm sure this was true for the Kane folks as it was for the Florio folks. You know, you want it over. You want to win, but at the end of the day, you want it over because you want the pain to stop. And this one went on until Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
And my favorite story is we went down, I think the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, to have a meeting with Jim in Washington to discuss what we were going to do. And it was pretty clear we were not going to win, that the recount actually showed that New Jersey has accurate vote counts, and we were not going to win. And the decision is that we were going to pull. Jim made the decision, and what he wanted the Thanksgiving weekend. And my job was to call then Assemblyman Carrie Edwards. And I remember the call where I got Carrie on the line, and I said, Carrie, it's Sam. The congressman would like to speak to the governor.
Aha.
And that was a signal to Carrie that we were pulling. Mm-hmm. And we just asked them to stay quiet through the weekend, which they honored and did. Mm-hmm. And Jim pulled on Monday, and then Tom Kane had his first press conference as governor-elect that afternoon, and I went back to the assembly.
Uh-huh. Who were some of the other folks who were involved in that '81 campaign that you worked with, whom I guess you were probably reunited with 8 years later?
Yeah, I mean, his chief of staff and chief political advisor was Joe Salima, mm-hmm. And he was really running the campaign. And Joe was a very skilled political operative. Not real great on the issues a lot of time, and except to feel for them, mm-hmm. the substance of the issues.
That was my own personal dealings with him. That was not what really interested him so much as the nuts and bolts politics.
But he had a feel for them in a political sense, which is frankly a good role for any candidate's guy mm-hmm. or woman. Should have a feel for how the issues play politically, because very frankly, you can hire a whole bunch of people that know something about the issues. It's the judgment part of it that's hard to develop. And he had very good political instincts and judgment. Mm-hmm. And I knew Dan Dalton from the legislature. And those were really the people that I knew mm-hmm. During that time frame. And we stayed in touch off and on. Dan was in the legislature, and so we stayed in touch.
Okay, so you went back to the assembly and worked on the assembly staff during Kane's administration.
Correct.
First 4 years in assembly, then moved on to the Senate, or
correct
over that 4-year period?
Yes, I moved to the Senate just about the time that the gubernatorial race, Governor Kane was running for re-election. Uh-huh. And Peter made the mistake of not figuring out how to get out of it.
Well, whoever would have been
I
the
love
candidate.
Peter Shapiro. I had a lot of respect for Peter Shapiro, and I had hoped that he would find a way not to do that.
Mm-hmm. I suppose a lot of people felt the same way, and didn't wish any ill to whoever it was who was going to face that juggernaut. Again, were you actively involved now primarily in fiscal issues and budgetary issues?
Almost exclusively. I was principal staff to the Assembly Appropriations Committee. I was...
So at that time there was no longer a joint appropriations committee?
Well, you had during the regular legislative session, there was an appropriations committee in each house. They came together to do the budget and form the joint committee.
I see.
But I had a very good relationship with Senator Weiss, mm-hmm. and one of the things we did was there was some tension, as there always is, between the Assembly and the Senate, no matter who controls them. It's not a Republican-Democratic thing. Mm-hmm. And there was always nervousness, I think, on the part of the Senate that there would be an attempt by the Assembly to say we ought to rotate the chair. And
who was the chair of the Assembly Appropriations Committee at the time?
Well, when I started, it was Dick Van Wagner.
Oh, yeah.
And then there was a guy you probably know named Bob Januszewski from Hudson County. And Bob determined that he would not challenge Senator Weiss. And Bob did, much like the call with Kerry, Bob called Senator Weiss and said, "Larry, Mr. Chairman, let me know what I can do to help you." And they sealed a relationship that worked very well for a number of years, where they really cooperated. And I was working for the Assembly staff, but kind of doing, in large part, Joint Appropriations Committee for Larry as well.
And Alan Karcher was Speaker of the Assembly at this time.
Yes, we had a very colorful and active speaker at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I've been fortunate in my time in government to really be able to watch a number of actors of different styles and different political persuasions, practice their art form. I must admit, I took something from every one of them, including Governor Kane. There was a lot of lessons to be learned there. So I watched, besides doing the fiscal and doing the budget and doing all the things that a staff person would do, it was a master's or doctorate level education on how people act in a political and leadership situation.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, I would say so. All right, so from 85 to 96 to 89, you're over on the Senate side.
Correct.
Now working directly for Senator Weiss and the
I'm working for
Appropriations Committee?
Senator Weiss. I'm working for the Democrats as a whole. I did mostly budget and fiscal, but I did some other things for the Democratic majority on, economic development and tax, issues and tax breaks, a variety of legislative things. I was senior enough and had been around long enough that I had enough knowledge and that I could handle a number of different subjects.
The Democrats were in the majority at this time, and Kane, the Republican, was the governor.
And the Assembly was in Republican hands.
In the second term, yes. But in the first term,
Chuck Hardwick was the speaker.
right? In the first term, you had a very volatile. No, I wouldn't call him volatile. As you said, a colorful Assembly Speaker, in Alan Karcher, who was a thorn in Tom Kaine's side, prodded him every opportunity he had. Yet, it appears as if there were some really, really good either back channel or direct relationships that developed between the Kaine front office and the Democratic offices and the Democratic staff in the legislature. There were a lot of things that ended up getting passed with bipartisan support. What was it about either the Kaine front office or the Assembly staff, Assembly and Senate staff, that enabled that to happen, that doesn't happen today?
I think there were a couple of things. First of all, the governor, meaning Governor Kane, started out in the legislature, and he understood it. And he was a very good legislative technician.
Had been a speaker, in fact.
And had been a speaker. And he understood the role of the legislature and how the legislature acts and whatever. He also had around him people that had been in the legislature or worked for the legislature.
Carrie Edwards was one whom you
Carrie
mentioned.
Edwards. We had some conversations. And what would happen, we also didn't take ourselves too seriously. This wasn't about some big political war. Yeah, we had problems. There was differing points of view. But there was space to accommodate governing, where we would do things together because that's what we were supposed to do. And oh yeah, we're fighting over here, but we're not gonna let this bleed into every part of the relationship. And I think that is what is different. And I discovered as I went on in my career in state government that there was in New Jersey a space for that.
Is there still?
I'm not sure. I'm not a practitioner every day there, so I can't say. But I think there is some space for that because, unlike what we see on the national level with what I'll call the two poles taking control of the national debate, In New Jersey, politics is always in the middle. There are people right of center, there's some people left of center. Yeah, you have some very conservative and very liberal, but most of the legislators at that time were in the middle. Chuck Hardwick was the new hard-charging conservative, but that wasn't true of all of his members. So I think there was space. One story illustrates it. The first year, people may recall, Tom Kean ran as a Reagan Republican. He was going to cut taxes, cut spending, supply side. And he immediately proposed taxes after becoming governor because he had a budget problem. And I think
that seems to be a rather common characteristic among New Jersey governors.
Yeah, because they usually get left with a big problem
Right.
from their predecessors. But what was interesting about it was, I mean, that's where Alan was making his point. He also had some other political points he wanted to make. But we got close to June 30th, and we still didn't have a budget. And the worry was that we were going to go into overtime. And New Jersey had never been in overtime and never been this close. Historically, the budget was reported out of committee in April and adopted before June 1st. And we're in the third week of June and nowhere close. So we're working on the budget. Everybody's going back and forth. There's really nothing there. And we had gotten close on a budget. So I went upstairs to the men's room. And when I'm in the men's room, in comes Carrie Edwards. And I said, hell of a problem, Carrie. And he said, yeah. I said, do you know how far apart we are? And he said, well, not really. I said, 30 million. 30 million then was a lot of money, but
Manageable.
Manageable. He said, oh, man. I said, Carrie, if your guy's willing to do this, my guys may be willing to do that. And he said to me, Sam, I'm going to have to go to the bathroom in a half hour. I'll see you. And I'll never forget it. I go into the men's room, in comes Carrie. He has stationed a state trooper at the door, holding the door closed.
He was counsel to the governor at this time? He wasn't
Yes.
Attorney General yet.
No, he was counsel to the governor. And he said, Tom will do it if you can promise me your guys will do it, and we do it quietly. So I went back with her. And then we went down. I was dispatched down to the OMB staff to work out the $30 million difference. And Dick Staniford and Rich Keevy were in the room, and they didn't know what was going on because the new administration hadn't had full faith in them because they were still there when Byrne was there. So what was funny about it is we walked in and we said, where are we? And I showed them the numbers, and they said, 30 million. We did it in about 5 minutes. And then we had pizza and soda for another half hour because we didn't want anybody to know how easy it was to close the final 30. And that's the way we did it. And we went home the night of June 30th with a balanced budget, which was later revised by January 1st. But there was space to do those kind of conversations because at the end of the day, I think everybody was looking after the goodwill of the state. They may not agree 100%, but they were willing to compromise, and they didn't see it as a sin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Would have been difficult to do later in the Kean administration, men's rooms deals, because the state treasurer was a woman.
Actually, Feather was wonderful, a great state treasurer, a great state treasurer.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's go with that. I mean, you had this relationship with Carrie Edwards. Now you're talking about Feather O'Connor, who was the state treasurer in the second Kean administration, and you say she was a great state treasurer. Obviously, easy for you to work with as a member of the Democratic staff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting that this was sweetness and light and we agreed on all issues. And when I met with her or her staff or the governor's staff on fiscal issues, that there wasn't some headbutting going on. I mean, there were some fundamental disagreements. But as I said, it never bled over to the point where we hated each other. Mm-hmm. And we would often figure out a way to compromise those issues in such a way that both felt as if they were heard and had a piece of it. The second thing is that, in some ways, and this was a different political time, you had the Democrats in control of the Senate. The Republicans had the governor's office, and they had and the assembly. And nobody had ever been there before. And I think John Russo, as Senate president, did a very wise thing. He announced that Tom Kean couldn't run again. No kidding, the Constitution precludes it. So he can't hurt us anymore. So therefore, we may side with the governor on a whole series of issues. And we, meaning the Senate Democrats, were closer in world viewpoint, I think, to Governor Kean's worldview than the Assembly Republicans were at that time. Mm-hmm. That's the growth of the beginning of the conservative wing of the Republican, Chuck Hardwick, et cetera. And so what happened is that we decided we'd side whoever was closest to what we wanted to have done, so that we didn't have two of them on us. And I think out of that, there was some out of that tension came some very productive legislation.
Mm-hmm. There are a number of people who have suggested that kind of tension is what leads to effective legislation, when the two sides are still willing to talk to each other back channel or in the men's room, or cutting deals however those deals need to be cut.
And cutting deals and compromise has become, the new four-letter word. It gets bleeped in the discourse today on a lot of levels, and that's unfortunate because I think everybody got some really important things done in that time frame without necessarily killing each other. And I think that, and not feeling as if I have to win at all costs. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some tribute to Tom Kean because he was, as I said before, he came from the legislature. He understood and had a feel for the legislative process. So he knew that it was a compromise process.
Did it help that the economy was booming?
Oh, it always helps when the economy is booming. And boy, it was roaring. So you had the resources you needed, that if you had to do a compromise that involved spending, you had the money to do it. Mm-hmm. It was a golden time.
You would find out just a couple of years later how much more difficult it would be when the money wasn't there.
Yes, in firsthand experience.
So let's go to the 1989 campaign.
Yep.
Did you leave the legislature to work on Jim Florio's 1989 campaign?
I did not. I stuck with the legislature. So I worked, there was a different campaign team, a different set of personalities, and they ran a very successful campaign. So I was, I probably was consulted on some issues, but I wasn't a principal in the campaign.
Were you consulted on fiscal issues, perhaps?
Not until after the election. I ran into the congressman and just told him that, be careful what you wish for, because I knew it was falling apart early in the year, and it was nobody's interest to have a big fight that year.
Do you think that Congressman Florio, candidate Florio, made a mistake in suggesting at the time that he had a very large lead in the polls that he didn't see any need to tinker with the income tax during the course of the campaign?
I never judge campaigns because I found that many times the rhetoric in the campaign gets amended and changed a bit. It's Brendan Burns' famous line, I'm not going to, I was never got, no, his famous line was, you misunderstood me. I said I would never raid Texas. And I think that is a notion of revise your campaign statement at a later date. I think candidate governor. Mm-hmm. Tom Kean was a supply side Reagan Republican. By January, he was a moderate Rockefeller Republican of the New Jersey color. Jim Florio, a Democrat, scared to death that he's going to get strapped as a Democrat with taxes. Realizes he's got a huge fiscal problem as governor-elect and governor. reality settles in, and that's usually what happens to these guys.
Were you aware of any back channel conversations or any conversations of any sort that were taking place between the incoming Florio team and the outgoing Kane team about trying to resolve some of the fiscal issues that were facing the state before Governor Kane left?
Yes.
Can you tell us anything about the texts of those conversations?
I will just say that I was brought into transition because I was the head budget guy for the Democrats in the legislature, and I knew Jim. I was in the transition in the distinct minority of the approach to fiscal issues. And I believed that we should, whatever Governor Kane was willing to do, we should let him do. And whatever actions he was going to take, which I would later learn from as treasurer and then in transition when the Whitman administration came in, is that, you know, with the right relationship with the outgoing governor, enormous things can happen during gubernatorial transitions. Transitions are treated, except by a few of us who appreciate. Transitions are the most important time of the first 4 years of a gubernatorial term. And they tend to be treated as a chance to fill cabinet spots and get people jobs. And it is the last freedom time you have. And you have a lot of maneuver room. And I am a great believer, and was then and to this day, that they pay far too little attention to transitions, gubernatorial campaigns. Usually they bring in a bunch of campaign people who are exhausted and whatever. And what you need is a group of people who are going to then work with the incoming governor to do what they have to do. You only need 2 cabinet officers the day you get sworn in. Attorney General and Treasurer. One to say, no, you can't do that because it's against the law, and the other one to withhold the money. And then you control the entire state government. So this rush to appoint people while not thinking about how you want to be governor and do governor. And I think a lot of people, this isn't a criticism of Jim Florio. I think I've watched this time and time again. You got to get your feet under, and boy, it's the last time you can get your feet under you before the white hot light turns on you and you have to act as
well, and it becomes dealing with the crisis of the day rather than with the bigger picture issues.
Right, and he had a real crisis coming in. I mean, it was not trumped up, it was not made up, it was real, and it was huge.
All right, now Doug Berman, who had been the campaign manager and became the state treasurer,
Correct.
Is credited or blamed, depending upon how you look at it, with having made the essential determination, the political determination, that Jim Florio should spend his political capital at the very outset of his administration. That if he was going to have to raise taxes, and if he was going to have to respond to the school funding issue, that he should do it and do it forcefully. Get it out of the way, take all of the negative, and then build up that capital again over the course of the next 3.5 years in order to get reelected. And so a major tax package came out of the administration. You were in the legislature and had to shepherd that through the legislature. That must have been interesting. Did you agree with that strategy? And how did legislators react to it?
Well, I think I got to separate myself from my staff position working for the Democrats and what my personal view was.
Well, let's talk about both.
So let me start with the personal view.
Okay.
I didn't disagree with Doug Berman on having to face up and fix it early. I think that was wise approach. I think the problem that some of us had was the rush to get it done. And I cut my teeth on the first year as an active player in state government, as I've mentioned before, the Kane first year, where he had a budget crisis. We passed a budget on June 30th that frankly wasn't worth the paper it was written on. We knew it was going to fall apart by October or November, but we needed a mechanism to keep the debate going. And my personal belief was that in order to raise taxes, cut spending, do whatever you needed to get through this, change the school aid for it, whatever the solution was, you had to give both the politicians and the public space and time. I'm afraid I come from the Rahm Emanuel school of politics that no crisis should go unused. And in this particular case, you had to take the crisis, in my view, and deepen it. That is, you had to do real difficult things. And I often thought that Governor Florio coming in was in a unique position to do that because he hadn't sat in the chairs of the legislature. He wasn't a creature of the state government. So therefore, he could come in and go, oh my God, look what I found.
Well, that's basically what he did.
Right, but he also proposed a solution. And sometimes I'm a great believer in, there's nothing like occasional fiscal crisis with what I call budget blood running down the street on West State Street in front of the Capitol, with all the constituencies and all the politicians and everybody starting to say, oh my God, the sky is falling. We're going to need a solution. And I think that's what happened in the Kane. People forget that the real Kane budget, in my view, was adopted on New Year's Eve day at the end of his first year. That's when we passed the income tax, and remember, he held his nose and signed it.
Right.
But he also held his nose and signed it on New Year's Eve. Politically worked for Tom Kane wonderfully. But that's when we settled it. But there was now almost 12 months of political and public debate about what to do about the state spending and taxes. And I think it helped educate everybody that we don't like it, but we understand you got to do it. In the case of, I think, with Florio, he had a lot of the right solutions. He had a lot of the right plans and reforms. Some reforms I think that, today's legislators wish they had adopted with him.
Oh, yeah.
Because he was way ahead of his time on some of them. But the thing was, it was how it was done as opposed to what was done. I think it hurt him that way.
Yet the legislature went along and did those things fairly quickly.
It wasn't that easy on the inside.
No, I'm sure it wasn't. John Lynch was the Senate president at the time. You were working for him.
Yep.
We've interviewed him as part of this series.
Brilliant guy.
And he's talked about the need to stand for something and the need to do it. And he felt, although there were cases where he really had to, he didn't use the expression strong arm, but I'll use it, really work hard to convince some of the members of his delegation, his body, that they needed to go along with this for a variety of reasons. But eventually it had to be done.
Yes.
And did you feel the same way?
Eventually,
as a staffer now.
As a staffer, I worked for the Senate president. When I first went to work for the speaker, the guy who hired me, Bob Smart, took me into the speaker's office and said, there's the speaker's chair, no matter who sits in it. That's who we're loyal to. And that happened to be Christopher Jackman at the time. So when John and the leadership made a decision that we were going to go, we did. But they made it after really, I think, almost stopping it in the Senate. It came very close to being stopped in the Senate. And John Lynch was a brilliant legislative leader. He was a brilliant policy guy. He really understood state policy and how to work it and the combination of politics and policy. And we came close to putting a budget in that had no tax increases in it. I did a draft budget through the night one night where I cut the budget into balance with no taxes. It was an interesting enterprise.
I'll bet it was. What do you remember the highlights of it?
All I can remember is about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Some friends of mine, Office of Legislative Services, stayed through the night to draft the bill. A great organization. And they were friends. I just remained friends with a lot of them. At one point, we got so close, and all they would chant is "go, go, go," and I had to come up with some other way to cut this or make this line up. We never did it, and we ended up passing the tax package. The rest is history.
There were, of course, these other initiatives, the automobile insurance, the assault weapons, that had come up at roughly the same time, or certainly in short order, all of which sort of contributed to this very chaotic first 6-month period. Were you at all involved in those issues as well, or are you primarily focused on the financial side of things?
I had my hands full with the fiscal. I mean, we were in trouble, fiscally in trouble, meaning the state, and that was a pretty big plate at that time. I knew the others were going on. I was watching the reaction, but I wasn't.
In the case of the assault weapons, it was hard not to.
No, that's true. That was true. But there's another case of where he was Jim Florio's problem. Everybody points and says all these things about Jim Florio. Jim Florio's problem is that he was ahead of his time. If you think about him as a governor, he was pursuing taking weapons away long before Newtown or any of the other tragedies that had been visited upon this country. He understood that was something you had to do. On the healthcare stuff, although that wasn't my area either, he was starting to do some of the things that are actually talked about in Obamacare. And probably Jim's fault, Governor Florio's fault, is in his ability to explain where this was going to be down the road. But the policy and the ideas and the things he did both on the fiscal and other policy issues, many of which have been visited by future administrations, and some wish he had been successful in some of them, would have changed, would have changed a lot of things. And it did change a lot of things. And unfortunately, some of the rollback that everybody wanted to do because it was Florio's, which is the same way you see people saying, if it's Obama's, we got to do away with it. Long term was a policy mistake, both fiscally and otherwise, for the state. He was ahead of his time. And when time caught up to him, I think he's been proven to be right.
What prompted you to move from the legislative to the executive branch in, this would have been 1991, early 91?
Yeah, obviously you collect the tax, the tax increase was over, guns, all of the policy agenda you have listed.
And the backlash had begun.
And the backlash had become. And it was clear, as with most administrations, the first group in the governor's office are the first to, go back out. Every administration, the first chief of staff lasts a year. Keynes was the case, Whitman's was the case. You just watch it. It just, because they figure out what they need. In this case, Jim was in trouble, and he went back to his friend, Joe Salima, to come in and kind of right the ship. He first had to start to repair relationships with Democrats in the legislature that were now facing election year and were in deep and serious trouble because of what was done and whatever. And so I was asked to come over and be deputy chief of staff. The other thing is that the recession started to deepen now. The great early 90s recession really started to hit home. And this is the recession that led to Bill Clinton being elected president of the United States. So what happened is that you had this huge tax package you weren't collecting all the money because the recession had hit, the economy was down, your tax collections were down. So he had the increased tax around his neck, and what's worse is he didn't even collect all the money. So what you had was a crisis in confidence in his leadership and whatever. And so I was brought over to kind of do some economic development and do some other work to kind of shore up and get some other policy stuff going that was kind of over here as opposed to all taxes and guns.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that you and Joe Salima were related.
At that time, we were.
Okay. Oh, at that time.
I forget when he married my sister, but yes, he was my brother-in-law.
Okay.
But I first met him back in the '81 campaign. We had a separate relationship.
Oh, and this is before you were related by marriage.
Correct.
Uh-huh.
We had a relationship, and he recruited me in '85 to go look at the race. So I had known him for a number of years.
Okay. Now he's the new chief of staff.
Yep.
You're the deputy chief.
Yep.
What are your primary responsibilities in the second year of the Florio administration in this capacity?
I was mostly trying to get economic development plans off the ground to create jobs and whatever and fight the recession, because the taxes had wounded him politically, but the recession was having an impact on the state and they wanted to move it. And so I spent most of the year working on that. I did do some budget work because not all the relationships after the first year internally were as nice as they once were.
That's an interesting way of putting it. One of the people whom we've interviewed earlier was Rick Wright, who was an associate state treasurer and working on those economic development issues.
Yes.
So you obviously were working.
I knew him and I worked with him, but there was a lot of competition between the new governor's office team and the team that was in Treasury, and that happens after you have a traumatic year.
Doug Berman was a very, very controversial character. In his first year as treasurer, he took it upon himself to be the only person who appeared before the Senate or before the Appropriations Committee, and none of the cabinet officers came to defend their department's budgets. And to a certain extent, Doug Berman became the target of the legislature's resentment toward the front office. What were your dealings with Doug Berman's Treasury Department beyond I mean, there are always going to be these kinds of conflicts within the administration. Were there serious conflicts between the front office and Treasury at this point, would you say?
There were some. I think they were largely personality and style, and there's the new team in the governor's office. They had organized the administration in such a way that the treasurer was more than just the treasurer, as many have probably told you about Doug's style. When the change came, I think there was some competition and whatever for both the governor's time and ideas. But you know, in the end, we managed to get the budget through the second year with as little pain as possible. The only thing was, I believe, and my memory's probably a little faulty, that's the year we sold a highway to balance the budget.
A piece of Interstate 95.
Yes, leading up to the George Washington Bridge, which almost brings us full circle sometimes. That was controversial and politically charged in the sense of pointing to whether the administration knew what it was doing or was fixing things on the fly.
Well,
and in some ways, and look, I don't go over to Doug Berman's house on Saturday night to have dinner. You can be assured of that. But the thing is that Doug was doing what any treasurer has done in a variety of administrations. The estimates of the tax coming in, dropped as the recession deepened, and sometimes you have to do that sort of thing. I thought it was rather clever fiscally, probably not presented the best way, And that's, if I have any criticism of Doug was, he had brilliant ideas, but sometimes his presentation, and sometimes you got to allow him to germinate. You got to let it kind of work for a while through this process, and it requires tremendous patience. And Doug, I think, sometimes didn't have as much patience as you had for the process.
How about the governor? Do you think that Jim Florio gave Doug Berman too much leeway? Do you think he could have reined him in, or do you think this was actually an extension of Jim Florio's own management style?
I think some of it was Jim's management style. I think particularly during the first year, you have a congressman who becomes a governor. And that's why I think transitions are important, because I think it helps, particularly if you have a congressman, whether it's Jim Florio or anybody else that takes over an executive. I think it's really important. And that's why the transition is important to that person, because they're going from a legislative to a government executive position. And you're running what today is a $30 billion corporation. What you need to know and how you need to handle that is enormously different than being in the legislature or in the Congress of the United States. I think Barack Obama has learned a lot about the difference between being a United States Senator and President of the United States. I'm not suggesting the governorship of New Jersey even has, an eighth of the complexity of the presidency, but it requires you to change your style. And Jim Florio is, like I said, he was ahead of his time on the policy stuff. He is a pure policy wonk. Yeah. This guy loves public policy, loves debating public policy, loves reading about it, educating himself on it. Not because some staffer wrote a memo. He read the books. So he was steeped in this, and that's what he was. The political presentation part of it, he was surrounded by a lot of wonks. But, I think he could have used some people the first time. Not me. There are a lot of people who could do it, who could help leaven that in a political Trenton process and not in a congressional style. Mm-hmm. But Jim is brilliant.
The 1991 midterm election results in the unprecedented election of a veto-proof Republican legislature.
Right.
And you become state treasurer.
Yep.
So, let's talk about these 2 years.
Okay.
You have to come up with a budget, a Florio administration budget that you know is going to be rejected out of hand the minute that you present it to this particular legislature. Walk us through the first couple of months of trying to piece together what would have been the fiscal year '93, I guess, budget, the one that would have to be passed by June 30th of '92, right, by what is now a Republican-dominated legislature.
Well, it was an interesting process because as a member of the executive branch and not the legislative branch, we get to propose, they dispose. But one of the things I had going for me is the new chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee was Senator Littell, who had been on the Joint Appropriations Committee the entire time I worked for the legislature. Mm-hmm. And even though I didn't serve him, I worked for the Democratic staff, the members of that committee got to know each other. And they might have disagreements, but they also work things out on a minor level. A bunch of ministerial stuff kind of was agreed to.
Yeah, I should point out that Senator Littell was a little further right than most of the members of the Republican Party of New Jersey, most of the senators of the Republican Party of New Jersey.
Verbally, yes, but at the end of the day, he knew that the government had to be run. Okay? So the chairman of the Assembly Committee is now Congressman Freelandheisen, also a member of the Joint Appropriations Committee of long standing, and who I got to know through that process. So the one benefit that the only thing I had going for me as treasurer was that I knew I had a relationship with these two men and their staffs, because remember, their staffs followed them to the Joint Appropriations. So we all knew each other. Mm-hmm. And that's the time when the Star Ledger used to write a story every day that we'd go to dinner after hearing days, and they would complain about the money being spent on us eating. But what happened is everybody got to know each other. And so on a lot of levels, you didn't start with, hi, my name's Sam Crane, and who the hell are you? You started with, hi, Senator, how are you? Or hi, Assemblyman, or Mr. Chairman. And so their staff and I knew each other. They represented their point of view, as they should. But we started off with some kind of a personal relationship, which I think made it easier. They were going to repeal the sales tax because Chuck Heitan was determined to do it.
Chuck Heitan was the new Assembly Speaker.
And somebody who I grew to respect, because as much as I thought he was wrong, and as much as we may have had some colorful conversations about state fiscal matters, when Chuck gave his word he would do something, he'd do it. And it was a great experience because I could, and if I gave my word to him, I never broke it. Because I realized that that was the bond that allowed a lot of other things to happen while we were fighting over the sales tax, because you had the rest of the government. And so that year we had the sales tax fight, and it was what it was. We ended up cushioning the cuts. We didn't do as badly. Budget passed pretty much on time. There was a lot of back and forth. The next one was much more difficult than that one.
This was the sales tax had been increased from 6 to 7%.
Is that correct?
In the Florio's in the first 2 years, and had also been applied to a number of items that it hadn't previously been applied to. So now the movement in the legislature is to repeal that, to bring it back to 6%, and to remove it from the items that had been placed on, right?
On some of them.
On some of them, okay. Toilet paper
Well,
being the
what
obvious
is interesting
example.
is the story can be written today that of the famous $2.8 billion taxes, they repealed less than 800 of it.
800 million.
800 million. The rest of it stayed in place because they couldn't do it because of the recession. They needed the money. In order to do the sales tax cut, they couldn't undo the rest of it. And so that it gets turned on its head in the rewriting of history, that they repealed the Florio tax plan. They did not. They repealed one part of it.
Actually, it didn't. The income tax part of it didn't get repealed until Whitman was elected, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. 2 years
And
after
only
that.
a portion of it.
Right. But my recollection is that Governor Florio vetoed the budget. Was that the following year, or was
No,
that
the first year.
The first
We vetoed the budget, they overrode us.
Right.
And part of that was the governor couldn't say, I unnecessarily raised this tax. This was a political decision. I think it was probably the right one at the time, that we said, look, we needed it. We said we needed it, and frankly, we still did, because we then started to bleed the government. I got a call a year and a half after I was out of office by the head of the transition team for Treasury, who called to thank me for thinning down the Department of Treasury. He never thought that the Treasury Department or any department in state government would be smaller when we left. We had fundamentally reduced the size of state government, which made the public employee unions mad at Jim too. So, I mean, he had it coming from all sides at that point. But he was managing in a fiscally responsible way. And we ended up with a fairly fiscally responsible budget. The next year was harder because it was an election year, and that all the politics was out because it was a gubernatorial year, and that's when it was really rugged.
Really? And I didn't recall that the following fiscal year was more difficult. Maybe that was because there wasn't the cutback on the sales tax anymore. This was now.
We reduced the size because we were laying people off.
Yeah, I do
and
remember
it
that.
was tough. And it's tough to lay people off, and it's tough to lay off people in the state government with bumping and civil service and union roles is the most difficult part of it.
Now, Governor Florio himself has said that there actually was quite a bit accomplished in the second 2-year. In the last 2 years of his administration.
Yes.
In part, perhaps because of the fact that there was this veto-proof Republican majority and you had to work together. So particularly in terms of economic development initiatives and in terms of welfare reform.
Yes.
Were two areas that he's pointed to as significant accomplishments that occurred.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you'd amplify on that.
Well, in some ways it's liberating when the legislature is controlled by the other party. You're by yourself. Now you're a sole actor.
As Barack Obama is.
As Barack
now
Obama, I
demonstrating.
think, has come to fully appreciate in the last month. And then you're playing off against them, but they also need you. And I think that's true of all administrations, has even followed it, right through the Christie administration, is there is a level in which there's certain things you have to get done to run the government. And quietly those things get done. I can't remember the year. It was during the Kane administration. We got a bad sales tax ruling from the Supreme Court. And we would pass every year something called a validating act. And that was to correct laws. And it is sponsored by the chair of the Appropriations Committee and the ranking Republican or ranking Democrat, depending on who controls them. And it passes on consent with no debate. We fixed the sales tax court case in the validating act. Tom Kane signed it. There was no pens hanging out. It was passed on consent with the chair rising and moving it, the Republican rising, in this case, Senator Moose Farran, rising and seconding Senator Weiss's motion to move the bill. All in favor, aye. All opposed, no. And we fixed, I can't remember the amount, but it was a substantial potential loss in revenue and that. That took cooperation. The same thing was true in the second 2 years. When I talked about Chuck Hytayan, there was a whole series of things that we did cooperatively with the legislature that were done maybe not with lots of noise, lots of thunder, but were done because we made agreements. And I think also, and I'm using Chuck Hytayan because Jim was kind of an ethnic Italian politician, and so was Chuck. And there was kind of we both climbed our way up to politics.
Though not Italian, Armenian.
Armenian,
Yeah.
but they both came up the hard way. They viewed their rise in politics as coming up the hard way. And I think there was, even though when they disagreed, they had a certain feeling for each other from their separate but actually joint experiences. And so I think that helped. So you still had the ability to have those relationships. And so my relationships with the members of the committee, Jim's kind of relationship with Chuck Hytayan, on some level we got a lot done. Fiscally, we paddled water until the election. The second year, we just did enough to get through. Because it was clear that we're not going to make any major fiscal changes in the middle of a gubernatorial election year. Not much positive can get done in that time frame.
November 1993.
Yep.
A very close election.
Yes, surprisingly.
Doug Berman was almost right. That you get that out of the way and you build it back up again, but didn't quite make it. I think
Didn't quite make it.
25,000 votes. How did you work with the Whitman transition team? You spoke earlier about, and rather eloquently, about really the importance of getting the transition right. How did you work with the incoming Whitman team in developing a transition between Florio and Whitman? Candidates who had faced each other and the incumbent had lost.
My view of transition was that I am loyal to the sitting governor, but I also felt an obligation to the Treasury Department and to the state government, after being around for so many years, that I gave at least my little portion of it the best transition I could. And because I'd been around so long, when I had the first meeting with the Whitman transition team, it was like old Friends Week. You know, one of the principal players was John Sheridan, who I knew from the Kane administration, and had a relationship with, not professionally, but had known John and had talked to John and had a lot of respect for John. And Lillian Barone from the Port Authority, who I knew. And so it was kind of like you had the new Whitmanite team that were looking at me like I was the devil incarnate. And then there was this other group of people.
I mean, Hazel Gluck and Judy Shaw.
No, but they weren't
Debbie
Treasury.
Torres,
They weren't Treasury.
Okay.
So but most of the Treasury team I kind of knew. And my belief was that I will serve the governor, but I will also cooperate fully with the transition team coming in because they won. And, you know, they're going to take over the government. The election's over. It's time to do what's best, you hope, for the state government and for the Treasury Department on the way out the door. The only unfortunate part is that they selected a treasurer very late. I only had one dinner with him right before she was sworn in. So I didn't develop a lot of relationship with him at that time. But I think I gave them a pretty good transition.
Did you give any thought to going back to the legislature at that point?
No, I decided, I went out and sought advice. And, you know, I could have gone across the street to the lobbying industry. I had spent my time in legislature, kind of been there, done that. I'd been treasurer. I wanted to be treasurer, been there, done that. And I got advice from someone who will remain unnamed who said, Sam, get out of Trenton, smudge the D in the middle of your forehead, and reinvent yourself. And that's what I proceeded to do. I felt as if I had been there long enough, and it was time to move on. And if you stuck in Trenton as a player, you know, all you're going to do is get asked about what they're doing. And, you know, I was done. I was exhausted. I had done my service, and I was ready to move on.
Tell us what you've been doing since then.
Well, I left there, and they were merging two business organizations in Newark, and I ran what became known as the Regional Business Partnership in Newark for about 8 years. And then I went to work for Mar Terminals out at Port Elizabeth, because as part of my stint as head of the Regional Business Partnership, we were supporting the dredging of the port. I got in those issues, and I got to know some people at the port, and then I got to know Brian Marr and went to work with him. They sold the company. I consulted for a couple of years, and now I work for Brian and Basil Marr doing their social giving.
There is also a crane consulting company. Is that still?
That's no longer in existence
okay.
as of July 1st. I have moved on. I'm now working for them full time.
And your name has shown up in more recent clips with respect to a couple of reports that have come out regarding infrastructure, transportation. Tell us about your involvement in those activities.
Well, shortly after the governor became elected, a group of us formers, and there are a lot of formers out there.
You're talking about the current governor.
Current governor. Formers, and we got former treasurers, we got former chiefs of staff, we got formers, whatever. And most of us have retired from what I call active political service, in that we're not riding in campaigns. We'll probably never go back and be in the government again. We've all done our duty, and I had a privilege of serving. And a group of us started to talk, and one of the things we said is, this is really messed up, and it's going to be messed up for a while.
You're talking now about the general
state finances.
finances, yeah.
And local finances as well. And so a group of us kind of created, facing our future, a group of Republican and Democratic former officials. We knew each other, we respected each other, we've done business across administrations. And we wrote a series of reports about what we thought the long-term fiscal climate was going to be. I regret to inform you we were right at our worst case. And then we also wrote a report on the need to invest in infrastructure, that we need to do something about our roads and our bridges. We wrote that in our post-Sandy period. We started before Sandy. And what was unfortunate, Sandy was unfortunate for the state of New Jersey for a lot of reasons. A lot of people got hurt. But going back to my Rahm Emanuel school, it was a crisis that went unused. Here was a chance to talk about what happens when infrastructure fails. Sewers failed, electricity failed, telephone failed, roads and bridges were down. And it made graphic for everybody why it is a public responsibility to make sure that you have good infrastructure and what the economic cost is if infrastructure is not maintained. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of that infrastructure is owned by private companies, but the state government has some say over it. And in fact, for our long-term economic view, for our long-term prosperity, New Jersey is dependent on those things. And we thought it was a time for Republican and Democratic politicians, because that's what we were. We're all different stripes. We thought that was an opportunity to engage the public with why it's going to cost you some money, but why this is important. Because you saw the failure of infrastructure. We timed the report right. I won't say it was greeted and accepted and moved forward in any way, shape, or form, because I think the politics there was not that much interest in pursuing it. But we will get back to that debate. I hope it doesn't take another terrible storm.
Mm-hmm. Well, we hope it doesn't either. What should I have asked you that I didn't? What recollections do you have of the Florio administration that come to mind, either anecdotally or sort of a general overview of your time in state government?
I think let me talk about Governor Florio first. I think there's this assumption out there that, and a view of him that remains somewhat fixed in time, of a guy who was cold in a three-piece suit no matter what happened, kind of like Nixon walking on the beach in California with the suit and trying to look human, but it wasn't. Jim really could be extraordinarily personable. And in settings where we were working through problems, listened and understood and went to school on what we were talking about. And I think because of the politics that surrounded the tax increase and the guns, those are the two things I think that are stuck with him. There's this notion of this guy who was just kind of snarling and pushing it through and everything else. And I don't think people fully appreciate how far ahead of his time he was. And I think that was somewhat his style, shortcomings. But when it came to understanding and putting a policy together and really working something through, he is a very impressive man. What I took away from the legislature, and to this day, my time in the legislature, and I'll tell it in the form of a story. When I was state treasurer, Jim, Governor Florio, obviously from South Jersey, Wildwood was in real trouble. The Wildwood Convention Center needed to be redone. And there was a young, not so young, but a good assemblyman named Frank Lobiondo, mm-hmm. who wanted to do the same thing, and he and the governor somehow talked. I get a call from the governor, Assemblyman Lobiondo's on his way down there. We're going to fix the Wildwood Convention Center. You figure it out. Which is exactly what a governor should do. Now, he has final say on what I figure out, and I'm supposed to work with him. So we worked together, and I don't even remember what the outcome is, but there was money put into the Wildwood Convention Center. And it fixed, and it turned, began the process of turning it around. Long after I had left the government, we were working on some port issues, and then Congressman Lobiondo was chairman of the Coast Guard subcommittee, which received a lot of port legislation. I was working for a company, I was doing government affairs. And we joined his congressional club for $2,000 contribution. He joined it. So I drive down to Vineland because he's having a congressional club breakfast. I was sitting there. In comes Congressman Lobiondo. I had not seen him in maybe 6, 7 years. He looks at me and he says, "Sam?" And I said, "Congressman?" He said, "What the hell are you doing here?" And I said, "You threw a breakfast and I was going to come." And he said, "Sam, that Wildwood Convention Center was the best thing I ever did in the legislature. And I want to thank, I want to thank you and Jim for doing it." And that is a lesson. With Frank Lobiondo isn't exactly a left-wing Republican by any stretch of the imagination, but there is a place where you can meet. It might be in a bathroom on the second floor to figure out how far you're apart on the budget, or it may be because an assemblyman wanted to make a wise investment to turn around the city, and a governor of another party didn't say, "No, I won't do it," because he's a Republican, and he voted to repeal the sales tax. Those were never connected. And so those are the lessons. So when I go to Washington, I get to see my former chairman, Rod Freelandheisen, my former friend who was a counsel in Kane's office, Leonard Lance, and I see that former assemblyman, Frank Lobiondo, who was, we did the Wildwood Convention Center. So the lesson I think there is that the public and those who study all this want to study what's happening in Washington. Perhaps the best thing to study is state legislatures and governors, because that is where the real work of the nation probably continues on while everybody's yelling and screaming at each other.
I can think of no better testimony to what is being done here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics than what you've just said about the study of governors and legislatures.
And you're to be commended for that, because everybody wants to study the federal government or New York City or Chicago or LA. And it is the states that will have, I think, have already had, and probably over the next term of the presidency of the United States, will have a much bigger impact on public policy than any federal officer.
Well, on that hopefully hopeful note, I want to thank you very much for your time and for your service to the state of New Jersey.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.